Greetings, welcome back to Black Bear News, where we are discussing climate change, abrupt climate change, and things adjacent. Please remember to like the video and to make sure that you are still subscribed. In this video, I'm going to cover a couple of articles. Not sure if I'm going to read the entirety of both articles, but we'll see how this goes. The first one is called "The People in Power Will Let Your Country Burn," and more news out of Australia, or dealing with the news coming out of Australia. This has been now, 2 or 3 weeks of just solid bushfire news. The response from the Australian government and the media to the country's unprecedented fires are a bleak vision of everyone's future. This is from January 8th by Ben Jenkins. An incredible bit of footage led the nightly news last weekend. A fire truck rounds the bend in the small country town of Neligan, New South Wales. In the background, we can see smoldering bushland. The truck slows as the firefighter behind the wheel spots the camera. He leans out of the cab of the truck and shouts, "You from the media?" He jabs his finger at the camera, looking exhausted and furious. "Tell the Prime Minister to go and get fucked from Neligan." Like the scale of the fires themselves, it may be difficult for an outsider to fully comprehend just how badly Prime Minister Scott Morrison and his Liberal government have responded to them. It's not just that they ignored warnings about the specific fire season, though they did, nor is it that they denied funding to the rural fire services when they begged for it, although they also did that. It's that from the moment the country started to burn, the people who run it have done everything in their power to ignore the true scope of the catastrophe. Even as the blaze spread, the air grew thick with smoke and people began to die. The reasons for this failure are worth exploring, because this is not a problem that is unique to Australia. The New York Times was one of the many international outlets who pointed to these fires in Australia as the new normal under climate change. And they're right about that, but far more alarmingly, Australia right now is a case study of how many governments and media will respond to these disasters and just how bad that response will be. If you were holding out hope that the cynical and partisan way we currently talk about climate change can't possibly hold in the face of actual climate disasters, when it's undeniably manifested itself in unbreathable air and burning homes and smoldering coastline, let go of that hope now. These fires have shown the status quo to be a stubborn thing, possibly an immovable one. It's rooted fast in place by money and politics and ideology. People in New Zealand, which is far from the east coast of Australia as the city of New York is from Haiti, can smell Australia burning. So far, at least 25 lives have been lost and over 1,500 homes have been destroyed. Hundreds of millions of animals have died. An area of 10.7 million hectares has been burned to the ground. The sheer scale of this area is difficult to convey, but if measuring things in cubas is helpful to you, it's around 1 cuba. While the rural and regional areas burn, urban centers are being choked by the ash and smoke. The New South Wales Department of Health considers any air quality index reading over 200 to be hazardous last week. Instruments in the capital city of Canberra read 3,463. People in New Zealand, which is as far away from the east coast of Australia, I just read that, they can smell Australia burning. There's not enough space here to catalog every failure from the Australian government in response to the above. But the whole fiasco can be broken down into 2 broad phases: smoke calm, then blind panic. The first phase lasted until very recently and is best typified by 2 weeks in early December. The fires had been raging for months, and Sydney had been breathing noxious smoke for weeks. On December 10th, around 20,000 people took to the streets in protest of the government's policies on climate change. Many of those 20,000 wore masks, not for anonymity, but because they couldn't breathe. But the line from the government was clear. Now wasn't the time to talk about political matters. The PM's focus was on helping the regional and rural communities who were trying to save their houses. 2 days later, when he was asked by reporters if he would consider payments to the volunteer firefighters currently working unprecedented hours trying to save those houses, his answer was no. We haven't needed to pay them in the past, he explained, and we don't need to start now. At some point In the days that followed, Morrison took his family to Hawaii for a holiday without telling the public. When people noticed he was missing on the 16th, his office flat out denied he was even there. Once they were forced to admit it, they said he wouldn't be cutting his holiday short. Again, the message was clear. These fires are sad, but it's nothing out of the ordinary. On the 19th, Morrison agreed to come home. By this time, 2 volunteer firefighters had already died, and a mass protest had formed outside the Prime Minister's residence in Kirribilli. When he eventually confronted the media 4 days later, his tone was petulant. Would he rule out another holiday before the end of the year? That was only 9 days away. A request reasonable to the point of redundancy, he refused. On the surface, Morrison's response makes no sense. Even from a cynical standpoint, there seems to be very little to gain in playing down a national crisis of this sort. A strong response rallies the nation. It shows you're a leader who acts. Best of all, there's no partisan division to navigate. It is a political truism that everyone, regardless of how they vote, does not want the country to be on fire. But this isn't about people, it's about ideology, and to accept the unprecedented scale of the fires and act accordingly is to accept that the climate is changing and something needs to be done. That's it. To me, this is the most striking aspect of the crisis. The debate about how best to douse a burning country has been seamlessly press-ganged into service in the ongoing culture war, all of which is amplified and buttressed by an increasingly demented right-wing media and an absurdly powerful fossil fuels lobby. It's difficult to overstate the influence and vitriol of the conservative media in Australia. The Murdoch press enjoys one of the world's densest concentrations of media ownership here, and it is perhaps for this reason that we managed to produce, despite an international reputation for insouciance, some of the most monumentally cruel and rabid conservative policy in certain areas. Immigration is one of these areas. Long before Americans were appalled at the government locking up refugee children, it was policy in Australia. Climate change is another, and if Australia is a sort of proving ground for just how much bile a populace can stomach from its media, it's worth watching how they've been behaved during these fires. In this crisis, the conservative media have defended Morrison against the most benign attacks. Even as the death toll climbed and the fury mounted, they have dismissed experts with decades of in-field experience as activists. They've spread thoroughly debunked theories about these fires being caused by environmentalists' opposition to preventative land clearing. Even bushfire victims themselves were branded as feral when they had the temerity to heckle the PM during a photo opportunity in their fire-ravaged town of Cobargo. Possibly most telling of all, Craig Kelly, a member of Morrison's government, went on UK television to deny any link between the fires and climate change, where even a wet golem like Piers Morgan couldn't let it pass. Back home, pundits on Sky News defended him, saying that they didn't know any more across the science than Kelly. And so warnings weren't heeded, rescue efforts weren't funded, Hawaiian jaunts weren't called off, not through incompetence, but through sheer bloody-mindedness. If you take one thing away from all of this, know that there are people in both the government and the media who would sooner see the country burn than confront the enormity of this problem. All of this should terrify you, because the appalling response to this crisis in Australia isn't an aberration. Like the fires themselves, it's the product of years of adverse conditions, a dominant conservative press, a powerful fossil fuel lobby, a class of politicians in the thrall of both that would look very familiar the world over. No one is being told to calm down anymore. The smug reassurances have given way to blind panic as it becomes apparent that not even the friendly media can shield the government from the rising ire of the public. But even as the Army is called in to assist in the relief effort, even as Morrison agrees to pay volunteer firefighters, even as a $2 billion recovery fund is pledged, the government refuses to alter its climate change policy. There are 2 more months of summer left. And that's the situation. Moving on to the last thing I wanted to cover in this video. This is from July 10th, 2017, so it's quite old. This is by David Wallace Wells and is an interview with Peter Ward, titled "The Models Are Too Conservative, Paleontologist Peter Ward on What Past Mass Extinctions Can Teach Us About Climate Change Today." I don't know if I'm going to read this whole thing, but I'm just going to give you a taste. Peter Ward is one of the paleontologists responsible for overturning our understanding of most of the Earth's mass extinctions, which long thought to be caused by asteroid impacts turned out to have been the result of climate change produced by greenhouse gases, all but the one that killed the dinosaurs. Anyway, we spoke the day after Donald Trump announced the United States withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accords. Peter Ward says, I wrote an op-ed for the Post. I don't know if they'll publish it. Probably calling Trump a war criminal was a bit much. Anyway, how can I help you? Honestly, what I'd love from you and what would most be helpful is if you could walk me through the analogy you made in that op-ed, exactly how our current situation could lead to the end Permian extinction. My own sense in the short run, strangely enough, the most dangerous thing facing us isn't the extinction scenario, since that's centuries in the future. What scares me more is this economic effect of simple sea level rise. CNN did a very interesting article some years ago about how much it would cost to retrofit ports around the world for a 6-foot sea level rise. It's literally trillions of dollars, not only docks, but every airport facing the ocean. Sydney, China, San Francisco especially. Secondly, there's the effect on human food. If there's a 6-foot sea level rise, it's astonishing how much food will be wiped out. Most rice is in low-lying areas, for instance. That's in the short term, David Wallace Wells. What about the long term? The long term is that these greenhouse extinctions are devastating. The most recent one was the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, and that was caused almost entirely by methane. So the scariest thing we're seeing today is the liberation of methane from higher latitudes, and it's happening far faster than anyone predicted. Golly, you think it's far faster than a couple of centuries? Or 2100? Did you see the news about, this came out in 2017. It's 2020. And every single year, almost every single month in that 3-year span has been this continued narrative about the models are too conservative and things are happening faster than expected, faster than expected, faster than expected. Faster than the models had predicted the year before or 5 years before or, whatever. Everything is accelerating, as we all know. Did you see the news about the Larsen Ice Shelf? It's starting to break off. I spent four expeditions down there just to the north of that, and the amount of retreat is huge. The reason this is important is Antarctica has always been used by the naysayers to say, at least in Antarctica, we're not seeing retreating glaciers. Well, now we are. We really are. And it seems as though the IPCC, this is from David Wallace Wells, IPCC predictions have been relatively on target on emissions and warming, that the predictions on ice loss have been far too conservative and things are happening much faster than anybody expected. Peter Ward, absolutely. One thing about IPCC is that the modelers have yet to figure out how to deal with cloud cover. It's very difficult to predict. As you're going to get more water vapor in the atmosphere, you're obviously going to get more cloud cover. That's where the models are still breaking down. It will take an enormous amount of mathematical work. And if anything, the sea level estimates have been underestimates more than anything else. The ice sheets really control our fates. In Greenland, of course. If we melt all the ice, we get at least 140 meters and probably more. Greenland is 15 meters by itself. One of the scariest places on Earth is right off Namibia. When I give a slideshow on global warming and past extinctions, the killer we're seeing is hydrogen sulfide. And right now there is something called the skeleton coast off Namibia, and the reason is that we're seeing hydrogen sulfide coming right out of the ocean. The final part of a greenhouse extinction is when that happens worldwide. That is something I was not aware of. So news to me from a 2017 article. But the worst place on Earth has to be Bangladesh. They are doomed. DWW, and it's such a densely populated place. Peter Ward, absolutely. As you know, as the sea level rises, it's like a diving board for storm surge. You're causing storm surge to jump ever farther inland, and then that in itself means huge inundation from storm surge. It doesn't have to be the rise to destroy the crops. It's just a bad situation. DWW, well, walk me through some of the other things you're worrying about. Food seems like one part of the doomsday picture, but what else are you concerned about? Peter Ward, well, heat. I believe that there are going to be some places that become uninhabitable for humans. DWW, how big a portion of the world's surface do you think that kind of effect will hit? Peter Ward, certainly Australia. Australia will be deemed uninhabitable. Already, Australia. The outback produces not much in the way of crops, but there are kangaroos. I live in Adelaide, and I've lived through some heat before, but we have had 40 degrees centigrade and 42 and 43 for weeks on end. It really has an effect. You get depressed. You don't want to go procreate because it's too damn hot. You just can't escape it. Everywhere you go on the equator, there is some sort of drug for the human population to try to get through the day. How do you get through living on the equator? It's so damn miserable. So I think the equator will become uninhabitable. We don't do well in heat. DWW, in your mind, what is our likely warming ceiling? Where do you think we're heading, and where do you think the range of uncertainty around that is? Peter Ward, I'm not a modeler, so I'm not the most prescient to do this, but we certainly could hit 5 degrees centigrade in the next century if we consider the status quo path. Coal is still amazingly cheap. Australia still exports coal. Coal continues to be a major problem. The simple fact is you have 9 billion people and the standard of living is increasing, so they're all going to want automobiles. They're all going to want steel and iron. And in order to produce that, you need to have sources of energy, huge sources of energy. I don't see wind turbines powering great steel mills. And as India and China become ever greater consumers of consumer goods, this is what's going to drive it, I think. DWW, I'm going to maybe read two more sections of this, and then I will link this below and you guys can read the rest. To me, it's been striking how much the green energy sources are growing and how much the prices are falling much faster than most prognosticators were predicting a few years ago. But it's also the case that there are all these warming feedback loops that are already in motion. And if you see them get sped up quickly, if some of them get sped up quickly, then there's almost nothing we can do to counteract those effects. Peter Ward, you're absolutely right. I've seen something, maybe as much as 10%, maybe as much as 15% of carbon may be coming from sources we don't even know about. These methane clathrates may be having a huge significance. And they hadn't reached 2019 yet. They are not being modeled, and we really are going to have unintended consequences and much more rapid heating than even the models say, for the simple reason that the models are highly conservative, too conservative. DWW, we've talked about food, we've talked about flooding and sea level rise, we've talked about direct heat effects, and there are other sorts of broad categories of things you're worried about. Peter Ward, disease. One of the great killers that people are not recognizing is dengue fever. Malaria gets all the press, HIV of course, but dengue is increasing. The mosquitoes themselves are obviously speciating and becoming ever more immune to pesticides because we've had these jumping genes. DWW asks, jumping genes? Peter Ward says what people are not really understanding is that genes can jump from species to species very easily. My 19th book actually is called Lamarck's Revenge, the story of epigenetics. My unique new take is epigenetics is the history of life. In the history of life, the reason we get these outpourings of new body types in the aftermath of mass extinction is not Darwinian. It's too slow. Epigenetics occur when there is an environmental change. It works from microbes all the way up. And so we can expect much more rapid changes in microbial genetics. I think the mode of evolution is going to switch from this random, slow Darwinian to a much more rapid form. DWW asks, and you mentioned a few minutes ago the runaway effects. Can you walk me through exactly what we should be looking out for, most worried about on that possible track? How does a runaway greenhouse effect get started on this planet? Peter Ward says, let's say we have a deep ocean basin off California and it's not getting its cold water oxygen because the surface water isn't water. Warm water holds less oxygen than cold water, so any ocean that is warmer is going to be less oxygenated. Excuse me. And once you switch over to zero oxygen, the microbes that were down there and the anaerobic microbes start taking over. And as these things take over, you get this black sea effect, and it begins spreading out. More and more of these microbes start producing hydrogen sulfide. So as it starts spreading, it grows like cancer of the deep ocean. They start spilling over the deep basin, start moving up. That's called a chemocline. And we're seeing the first part of this in the Pacific. Are these effects confined to the ocean? DWW asks Peter Ward, well, hydrogen sulfide does come out of the ocean. That is why Namibia is so scary. What else? Peter Ward says, one of my PhDs just finished his study on seagrass die-out. We're losing seagrass globally, and it's a huge economic blow. And it's definitely caused by global warming. Why is it important? Because most seafood spend some time as juveniles dining on seagrass. An article on seagrass die-out itself would be huge. Let's see how long this is. Oh, it's quite long. Yes. DWW asks, tell me about your background and how you came to study mass extinctions generally, but also when you came to think of them in terms of our present day. Peter Ward says, I was really just a classically trained paleontologist. To me, the mass extinctions were really interesting in terms of what happens after them. We have this dead period, and the recovery fauna is totally different. And that leads to the idea of, gee, how much longer will the recovery be if we have an extinction now? Impact was key and king for the 1980s and 1990s. Every one of the big extinctions was attributed to impact. But it became clear that, in fact, no, these were not impact extinctions. We had to invent a new term. I don't know who came up with it first, but I was there pretty early calling them greenhouse extinctions. And this new paradigm started coming into play. We're even starting to see that KT also has a greenhouse component because there was a warming right at the impact. One more. DWW asks, tell me more about the Permian extinction because that's the most dramatic. I wonder what makes it so exceptional and in what ways we can watch out for our heading down the same path. Ward says, people always think the intensity of a mass extinction should be related to the extinction. What percentage of creatures were extinct? Increasingly, we're thinking that's a metric, but a more important metric that tells you something about the nature of the devastation is how different is the fauna that comes afterward. That's all I've got for this video. There's just a few more questions in here, and I'll link this article and you can read the rest below. But pretty old article, but interesting nonetheless. Tomorrow will be the live stream at 11 a.m. Pacific time, so I will see you that time tomorrow. Thank you so much for your eyes, your ears, and your conscience. If you would like to support this channel, you can do so at the links below. Until next time.